A young TS Eliot is at Harvard, where the field of psychology is just now emerging. You can read Freud, of course, but there's nothing like behavioral or analytic psychology. Those haven't been even developed yet. But there are dreams, and what exactly are those? Freud himself starts his book by citing what the Greeks thought they were, which in many cases were visions of alternate realities, a channeling of the gods, a means of clairvoyance where the future, or at least possible futures, could be revealed. And what was science supposed to do with all of that? Well, one answer, and one that T.S. Eliot studied, was that there was a place between heaven and earth, between the purely spiritual and the definitely physical. Eliot begins to wonder, as did Hamlet and then Victor Frankenstein, whether there was more in heaven and earth than was dreamt of in philosophy or dreamt of in science. And so the youthful Eliot, seeking a truth that the world itself was only beginning to come to grips with, would not only experiment with the occult, but put it rather directly in the forefront of his literary work, including and especially his defining poem, The Wasteland. After his fame arrived, he would take up a side project, writing a light book of children's rhymes about cats. And one of those poems for that book he never finished. That poem talked about the dream space, maybe that third space between heaven and earth. But that poem went nowhere. It was probably too serious for a children's book. He stuck the poem in the back of a stack of paper. The heavy-side layer would not come out in his book about cats. But it would get resurrected after his death to form the central frame for the musical. How deeply was T.S. Eliot involved in the occult? Why did he put that theme in such a central place in his best poem? How come he kept describing writing poetry like an instance of demon possession? Grab your rosary beads. Let's all stay safe in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. This is the 5th episode in the series about cats. There will be some brief allusions to some things we developed in more depth in the earlier 4 episodes, so go back and give those a listen if a reference to Ezra Pound being criminally insane doesn't immediately make sense to you, or why that's relevant. And if you're a show of the family Miz or The Man of La Mancha, those are 2 musicals that they're full series about, so if you want to go back and give those a listen, that would be great. There's also a new email. It's theaterhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Drop me a line if you can. I would just love to know what you think about the show or about the musicals or about anything else, or just let me know that you're out there and you're listening. I appreciate this, but I'm not really taking paid sponsorships for this time. So the only way I know that you are listening is my download count, which is a little, not I'm 100% confident means that you're all listening and engaged, but drop me a line. Let me know what's going on. As always, the show is clipping along and we're staying healthy, but the audience needs to grow for this to stay viable. So anything you could do to help spread the word would be great. Reviews help, reposting helps, dropping it on social media helps. So thank you so much for joining me in these astounding tales of random chance and musical theater. Honestly, I appreciate it more than you can know. Finally, the show will deal with the occult, mostly as it was experienced historically by T.S. Eliot. But if that's an uncomfortable topic to you, just know that it's coming. So let's dive right in with a question of the moment. Do you believe in ghosts? Like paranormal phenomena? Well, according to some reporting that recently appeared in The Hill, which I will drop in the show notes, a majority of Americans do, maybe 60%. And if you expand that slightly to ask how many believe in the devil, the number goes up to over 70%. And if you ask, do you believe in God, the number jumps up to around 85%. Now, Hill is citing a poll by a group called Real Clear Politics, which has a decidedly right-wing look at the world, but the question seems nonpartisan enough, and the sample was very evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, so I'm willing to trust it. As far as a poll about the belief in ghosts goes, at least one read of these results is that God polls better than Satan, which is reassuring, but the third-party candidate, do you believe in aliens, comes in pretty close to ghosts, decidedly behind Satan, however. That seems to mean that more people believe in a human soul than believe in life on other planets, although one seems like a scientific uncertainty and the other is, I guess, not really a scientific question. But Be all that as it may, the take-home point for here is that if you believe that there is some spiritual dimension to human existence, you are in the solid majority, like 80% majority. If you believe in the devil and demons, you're in a solid 70% majority. By itself, that seems to make this a topic worth pursuing. The trick, of course, is to figure out what exactly the nature of human spirituality is. This has occupied more than one thinker. In the past episodes, we talked about how Victor Hugo struggled with the question. He very much believed that there was a spiritual element to human life, but he couldn't squarely align himself with either mainstream Catholicism or Protestantism. He is currently, however, a venerated saint of the Cao Dai religion in Vietnam, whose membership numbers in the millions. And Scott Carter, a very successful television producer, has made the discovery that Thomas Jefferson, Charles Dickens, and Leo Tolstoy all had made edits to their own Bibles, crossing out the passages they thought were wrong, making word changes, and he has based a play on the implication of those historical facts. It's well worth checking out, and crazy, is it not, that a diverse group of such powerful thinkers all thought that the Bible needed editing, unalterable final truth word of God, maybe not so much in their eyes. So Hugo was not alone in reading his Bible, being drawn to much of it, but finding something that just made it difficult to read as a single, coherent, consistent narrative that all lined up with a comfortable belief system. If all that makes your head spin a little bit, let's just focus on the idea that you can believe in human spirituality and probably that every human has a soul without being a strict adherent to any particular religion or religious doctrine. That happened to Hugo, it happened to Dickens, it happened to Thomas Jefferson, and it happened to Leo Tolstoy. But for a long time, it didn't happen at all, at least in what we call the Western world. Catholicism so dominated what was thought of as spirituality and the existence of the soul that when Martin Luther tacked some fairly tame tweaks to the mainstream ideas, it caused a revolution, and one that we are still feeling today, of course. Luther nailed his theses up in 1517 on October 31st, no less, and 300 years later, science was going to press the questions in a significant way. Not so much by challenging the idea that if science was right, God must not exist, but by making so many massively important discoveries so fast that it seemed like science might just prove the existence of, well, maybe God, but maybe one of those other polling candidates like demons or aliens or especially ghosts. And that is where this long road takes us back to TS Eliot, who will eventually write a book that will eventually be turned into a massively successful musical. All right, so right at the turn of the 20th century, which is the year 1900, I only mention that because I always get confused when people say 20th century. I keep having to do the math in my head to get back to what years those were. Anyway, right between 1900 and 1930, science is changing everything. In 1850, the horse was the only practical real means of travel. But between 1880 and 1920, the so-called golden age of the railroad had exploded, massively increasing the opportunity to move quickly and temporarily even between cities. You could wake up in Boston, take a train to New York, and be back to Boston by the night. You couldn't do that before there were trains. Humans had learned to communicate with each other through invisible airwaves. And between 1900 and 1930, wireless use expanded so much that in 2 out of 3 households there were radios. The Wright brothers got airborne in 1903. By 1914, there was the first commercial air flight. Personal air travel was established, if still very uncomfortable, by the 1930s, and by 1957, it had replaced ships as the preferred way of crossing the Atlantic Ocean. All this happened in T.S. Eliot's lifetime. The automotive fleet went from 8 cars, that is correct, 8 cars in 1900 to more than 3,000 by 1915, to more than 24,000 by 1936, that is more than exponential growth, to 800 million on the 405 freeway alone. If you live somewhere else, you might think I'm exaggerating, but if you live in LA, you can probably acknowledge that although that figure is roughly twice the population of the entire United States, on any given Friday at 4 p.m., 800 million cars on the 405 sounds just about right. Anyway, cars have become a defining part of American culture, and they didn't even exist in 1900, but they're now completely ubiquitous, a change that Eliot was watching happen. So to our point, right as Eliot was coming to grips with his own beliefs, science was making it so that humans could talk to each other through invisible air radio waves, could fly through the sky, could travel on the ground by powered motor vehicles, and could move between cities quickly by rail. And nothing like those things had ever been possible at any point in human history, even as recently as 50 years earlier. Science, it seemed, could do almost anything. So what if science was capable of proving once and for all whether or not ghosts existed? Victor Hugo, of course, the author of Les Mis, thought that they might. His idea was that psychics would contact the spirits, ask them about important scientific questions, have the answers written down in sealed envelopes, and then opened only after science had solved the problems. If the answers matched, that would prove that the spirits were real. But that wasn't the only approach to the problem, and some of the answers didn't even depend on technology. In our episode on Victor Hugo and the seances, we learned that in 1848, the Fox sisters in New York claimed to be able to communicate with spirits with knocking noises and eventually by tables wrapping out a code so that the number of taps would correspond to a letter and spell out words. They were a sensation. There were retractions. There were retractions of the retractions. The whole movement was called spiritualism. They'd started in 1848. By 1851, it had leaped to the continent of Europe and taken it by storm. By 1857, one Allan Kardec became a leading figure, and he worked on establishing a system of peer review to separate the fake mediums from the real deal. One could hold a seance, they could make a transcript, and then send those notes up the line. And if Kardec liked them, he could publish them in his journal called Revue Spirit. That is taking the scientific process of peer review and applying it to spiritual seances as part of the spiritualism movement. So the world that T.S. Eliot inhabited had the best students of his day, and with apologies to Yale, let's just say like the ones at Harvard, which is where Eliot was a student, were grappling with all these questions. Catholicism was still going strong, but had long since listed script on the only way to interpret Christian doctrine. So maybe science could make some scientific observation that could prove that ghosts existed, or maybe there were just other approaches to spirituality that relied less on ancient texts to provide clear answers and relied more on direct conversations with those who were actively in the spirit world. If you could talk to ghosts, if you could talk to your relatives over a wireless communication, why could you not talk to the deceased if you believe they had a soul? So we are now at the academic study of Eliot. And here I'm going to be relying very heavily on Donald J. Childs of the University of Ottawa. And his article is entitled T.S. Eliot and the Occultation of Knowledge and Experience, that appeared in the journal Texas Studies in Literature and Language. It's, of course, got its citation in the original transcript for the series. It starts with this sentence, quote, T.S. Eliot's early interest in the occult is widely known, end quote. In 1935, an occultist named A.R. Orage passed, and an obituary about him was penned by T.S. Eliot. That's because earlier in life, Eliot had been in Orage's orbit, and he turned away from it, not because he didn't believe in a spiritual world, but because he believed it was the wrong kind of spiritual world. But in 1935, Eliot was a big deal, and Childs finds it meaningful that this big-shot literary figure would take time to write an obituary for a much more obscure occultist, although I should note that Orage was also a literary critic of some note. At least he was good enough to get published. But to Childs, it might suggest that Eliot had been pretty passionate in the ideas of Orage and other occultists before he finally landed on his own beliefs. Why otherwise would Eliot be writing an obituary for this guy? As another clue to how deep Eliot's interest was, Eliot's big poem was, of course, The Wasteland, and he published more than once. And in one influential printing, Eliot had appended a bunch of notes to it. In those notes, he talked about the tarot card reading part of the poem and tried to make it look like he didn't really understand the way the cards worked all that well. But Childs quotes three other authors, including one named Tom Gibbons, who wrote that Eliot knew, quote, considerably more about occult literature than he admitted to in his notes on The Wasteland, end quote. And all this suggests that Eliot didn't just have a passing interest in the occult, he was pretty deeply into it. This period, according to Childs, was from 1910 to 1922. One Lindell Gordon reports that in 1910, Eliot walked the streets of Boston and had a vision of people dividing and shrinking, and that this vision would eventually show up in one of his poems called The Silence. Now, earlier in this podcast, when we were tracing the origins of Les Mis, one of the original authors named Bublil reports an eerily similar experience after having watched a production of Jesus Christ Superstar. He too wandered the streets, also describing it as if he was in a trance until inspiration struck him at dawn. The ultimate result was the musical version that would eventually become Les Mis. So, if you are looking for some consistency of story to show that maybe there are ghosts in the theater, look no farther than the trances that the author who inspired Cats and the producer who made Les Mis both had. It would surprise no ancient Greek author that the great poets were struck with supernatural visions. In 1920 and 1921, Eliot was working at a literary journal called The Criterion, which was sponsored by a Lady Rothermore. She held seances, and Eliot and his then-wife Vivian attended them. Vivian was no fan of Lady Rothermore and accused her operation of being a, quote, asylum for the insane where she does religious dances naked, end quote. That's pretty pejorative, but there was an institute. They did have naked dances, and they were supposed to elevate consciousness. I may be pretty close to Vivian on her assessment of this one. But there is something to be said for dance and ecstatic dance. There are, by the way, so-called ecstatic dance events, such as the ones held today in Portland, which are definitely designed to enhance consciousness. And there are some news media reports that these involve nudity, although the current webpage for that event makes no mention of nudity at all, although there are a bunch of rules: no shoes, no words, no instructions from the facilitators, no judgment. Nudity aside, dance is definitively one way that people tried to connect to some forms of spirituality, and it's still an active movement, and Eliot's wife Vivian didn't like it very much, which probably means that Eliot did, since they didn't get along about anything. Anyway, there was one approach to spirituality in the exploding scientific era of the 1900-1930. That was spiritualism, but there were at least three others, according to Childs. There were the spiritualists who believed that the human soul survived physical death, the psychical researchers who believed that they were objectively gathering information about a possible spirit world, and a third branch called the Theosophists, strongly associated with a leader named Madame Blavatsky, who disapproved of seances. The psychical researchers and the Theosophists eventually fell out when the psychical researchers exposed some fraudulent claims by Blavatsky, but all of these were active contenders for spirituality, and in fact, there were regular reports in both the Boston and the London newspapers reporting on issues about the occult. They were just reporting on it the way you would talk about the comings and goings of the Catholic Church. All this reinforces the perception that this was an era of massive technological and social change, and some new form of spirituality might emerge to claim the devotion of those looking for spiritual fulfillment, especially if they didn't find it in the traditional Christian churches. Between 1910 and 1914, Eliot was exposed and involved with all of these movements. In 1914, he read a book by Pierre Genet that had to do with the occult and demons in particular, and he made some notes like any college student might. Those notes still survive. We'll get deeper into their content in the next episode where we'll talk about demons. But for now, they show an interest in the occult and especially in disassociation. But the idea in that book would resurface in Eliot's later published poems and criticism, which is also evidence that they made a pretty deep impression on them. Childs writes, quote, Theosophists, psychical researchers, fortune tellers, astrologers, therapeutic spiritualists, Eliot had personally met examples of them all by 1917, end quote. Among other things, Eliot liked hearing and telling good ghost stories, according to Childs and some other sources. And finally, while at Harvard, Eliot encountered the writings of William James, who wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was a source book on mysticism. Later, while he was at Oxford, he would take a course from a guy named William McDougall, who was both a member of the Society for Psychical Research and a champion of James. During this time, Eliot understood the themes to be roughly akin to the, quote, there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your science, end quote, and wrote, quote, an unpublished essay on Kant, which suggests Eliot was prepared to accept this part of McDougall, James, and the Society of Psychical Research's message, end quote. And so the occult was more than a party trick to Eliot. According to Childs, quote, James provided for Eliot what he provided for McDougall, a certain intellectual respectability for a critical as opposed to a wide-eyed interest in the occult, end quote. In 1919, Eliot published a poem with a reference to Madame Blavatsky, and especially his writings about the 7 sacred trances linked to the 7 secret rays. And to Childs, this shows that Eliot regarded the occult as something like a midpoint between the mundane and physically actual world and the divine. This was, according to Childs, what drew Eliot to the ideas of a Raj. All this exposure shows up in his most famous poem, The Wasteland. The poem itself, of course, involves a seance and many, many mystical references. But it might be more than that. The poem itself might have been an expression of the occult. This fascinates me. Let me quote from Childs again. I'm going to quote extensively because I do think this does something to tie that poem to the occult rather directly. Here's the quote from Childs. Indeed, Eliot implies during an apparently autobiographical digression in The Pensies of Pascal, published in 1931, that his experiences during the composition of The Wasteland might have been an instance of automatic writing. There's a quote within the quote, so I'm now quoting Eliot directly. It is a commonplace that some forms of illness are extremely favorable not only to religious illumination, but to artistic and literary composition. A piece of writing meditated apparently without progress for months or years may suddenly take shape and word. I have no good word to say for the cultivation of automatic writing as the model of literary composition. I doubt whether these moments can be cultivated by the writer, but he to whom this happens assuredly has the sensation of being a vehicle rather than a maker. Okay, now that quote from Childs, Eliot is no longer speaking, goes back to the voice of Childs. For Eliot, who was suffering a mental breakdown in 1921 when he composed the Metaphysical Poets and most of The Wasteland, and for the Eliot who was attending Lady Rothermore's seances at the time, the experience of Genet's neurotic occultists served as a psychological and literary model, end quote. Okay. So let's slow that down a bit. How much is T.S. Eliot affected by the occult? Well, at one extreme that we might call not much at all, Eliot is just trying to puzzle out where the inspiration for his poems comes from, and he's fully aware that he can't really articulate where it is other than he feels like he's the vehicle and not the creator of the poems. That's something that he made clear in an essay called 3 Voices of Poetry, and many times throughout his career. A huge part of his literary criticism, which is called the New Criticism, is that Eliot did not believe in elevating the author of a poem when trying to figure out the meaning of what it meant, because the author might not understand where the poems came from any more than anyone else did. In other words, if you wanted to know what a poem meant, you could ask the author, but their interpretation was no better than the readers of that poem. So that's the version of things where Eliot has some interest in the occult, and he likes ghost stories, but they aren't really influencing his writing. He's just got a literary theory, and one metaphor that helps him explain it is the spiritual world. In the middle, you might say there's a version that goes, it's more than that. The particular ideas of the occult influenced Eliot. Childs makes the excellent point that even though The Wasteland does talk about there being a spiritual world between the solid earth and heaven, that's not necessarily a good thing. The visions might be misleading or dangerous. But it's possible that Eliot just isn't using Madame Sosostris as a metaphor for something in The Wasteland. He might be offering her seeing abilities as a real thing that should be taken seriously, if only as a warning. That's the middle interpretation, that there is something to this. There's enough to the occult that it is influencing Eliot, even if, and he's using him as more than just a metaphor, but it's not like he was literally possessed by demons. But the opposite end from all of not much at all is a place that we might call ghosts are totally real. In these waters, the wasteland itself is a product of contact with the spirit world. In fact, the whole poem might have been dictated to Eliot by a spirit via automatic writing. In fact, Eliot might have been possessed by a demon who just used Eliot's physical body as a vehicle to move the poem into the world. The poems of T.S. Eliot, in this view, might themselves be both demonically inspired or maybe even themselves demonic. As ghost stories go, this one is not without precedent. If you go to the American Bookbinders Museum website, there's an entire page dedicated to the idea that a book or a story might be cursed. They cite as, quote, the definitive work on book curses, end quote, a tome called Anathema, Medieval Scribes and the History of Book Curses by Mark Dogan. Their tales include ancient Egyptian clay tablets with curses written on them, medieval books that included curses on those who would defile the books, including ravens gouging your eyes out, and H.P. Lovecraft's dreaded volume, the Necronomicon, a cursed book that brings calamity upon anyone who dares open it. This, of course, is Bruce Campbell's 1992 horror classic Army of Darkness plot, where the central point is that a book called the Necronomicon is opened, unleashing demons, I guess, onto the planet. If you are into horror camp and you have not seen this one, treat yourself to it on Netflix. And even the Hogwarts of Harry Potter has a cursed section of their magical library. Here's that quote from the Harry Potter book. Quote, "Dangerous," says Harry, laughing. "Come off it. How could it be dangerous?" "You'd be surprised," said Ron, who was looking apprehensively at the book. "Some of the books the ministry's confiscated. Dad told me this. There is one that burned your eyes out, and everyone who read sonnets of a sorcerer spoke in limericks for the rest of their lives. And some old witch in Bath had a book that you could never stop reading. You just had to wander around with your nose in it, trying to do everything one-handed." End quote. That's the end of our Harry Potter. So, there is a long storied tradition of ghost stories involving cursed books and tales, and one story about T.S. Eliot is that his work was conveyed through him by some new supernatural entity based on the tone of the wasteland being not a very happy one, and that those ideas are unleashed into the world with a very nefarious effect. This might explain why Vivian, Eliot's first wife, who some scholars have claimed had a large involvement in his writing, was very influential on his literary output, was constantly physically and mentally ill, and finally deteriorated into pure madness. It might explain why Ezra Pound, Eliot's best friend, who was eventually revealed to be a thorough editor of the final version of The Wasteland, descended into anti-Semitism, Nazism, and fascism, and also died while in confinement, his in an institute for the criminally insane. If Eliot is the poet laureate of modernity, as he is widely accepted to be, maybe his poem ushered in the supernaturally evil elements of the modern world, including industrial warfare, environmental pollution and destruction, loss of faith, and all the horrors Edvard Munch captured in the painting that best encapsulates the modern age. You've seen it 100 times. It's called The Scream, a half-human, half-ghost wailing in terror at nothing in particular, but maybe just about the human condition overall. Maybe what Munch did in his painting, Eliot did in a poem. And maybe that was not the work of Eliot at all, but a demon speaking through him. The loss of faith, the loss of God leaving the planet has ushered in a modern age of evil, and Eliot knew it. Now, this is a far cry from Cats, but let's remember that Andrew Lloyd Webber stitched together many elements to make a plot for his musical, and the thing that he used was called the Heaviside Layer, that there were just a bunch of poems about cats. Lloyd Webber, according to his own account, needed to have a plot that came around that, and they decided the Heaviside Layer would be the thing that would do that. Now, this appears nowhere in T.S. Eliot's book titled Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats, but it does exist in fragments of unfinished poems that Eliot's second wife supplied to Trevor Nunn, who is the director of Cats and also of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Could it be that Eliot knew that there was real evil included in his poem fragments, which is why he never finished them, and their curse was unleashed unwittingly upon the world when his surviving widow naively gave them to Andrew Lloyd Webber and his team? And this unholy presence explains the towering success of a show without a plot. The Heaviside Layer is a supernatural place, but what if it's purgatory and not heaven? Is Grisabella the victim and not the heroine of a larger evil plot? Something like you see in the movie The Omen or The Vampire Lestat, where an ancient evil returns out in the open in the form of an agribusiness corporation or a rock band formed to feed a vampire conspiracy. Could that be what the musical Cats is? I am now fully off the deep end, and I will go even deeper into the woods in the next episode. But if nothing else, I'm remaining true to my promise of exploring every supernatural angle that comes my way. Let's just say, to bring us back to reality, that everyone agrees that T.S. Eliot exposed himself openly and enthusiastically to the occult, and that he likened the construction of poetry, including and especially his own most famous work, to demonic possession or maybe even automatic writing. The only open question is how much of that is a metaphor, which it most certainly probably is, and whether it might be literal, which it no doubt probably is not. But that does get us back to the original question that opened the episode. Do you believe in ghosts? Are you one of the 70% who believes in the devil? If so, you don't have to squint very hard to see a darker side in the occult influence on T.S. Eliot. Now, this is not where our friend Donald Childs ends up, although he does offer some tidbits. In Childs' interpretation, the reader is supposed to be skeptical of Madame Sosostris by the end of The Wasteland. But not quite. Her tarot reading is largely accurate. As Childs writes, and since we are talking about the occult here and he's the main source, I'm going to give him some space here. Quote, "From this point of view, Madame Sosostris is so far from being undercut as to be affirmed with a Teresis as one of the true seers in the poem." End quote. In the end, Child sees in Eliot a dualism. As a younger person, Eliot was willing to entertain that there might be something to the occult, and he teases that out in The Wasteland. But his later poems, including the quartets, which won him the Nobel Prize for Literature, Eliot is openly scornful of the occult. It's the wrong kind of spiritualism. But, concludes Childs, it is an interesting form of spiritualism, one that continues for Eliot to mediate the space between the material and the spiritual. This is very true to Eliot's embrace of a way of knowing the world that is always uncertain. The key phrase is that the critic should, quote, "find fact nowhere and approximation always," end quote. Now, if you survived an undergraduate philosophy class and remember the allusion to Plato's cave wall, this is it, baby. We never see reality directly. We only see shadows of what it must be and try to guess what it's like. By keeping Madame Sosostris in this space, Eliot puts her in an honored place where all you can say about the spiritual world is maybe. One last tidbit, Madame Sosostris turns over a card and exclaims it is, quote, "the drowned Phoenician sailor," end quote, a line that Eliot puts in his poem that comes straight from Shakespeare. Let's just remember that Eliot put Shakespeare in his poem right when he was attending the seances of Madame Rothermore. And flipping back just a few episodes, Shakespeare is the same character who appeared to Victor Hugo when he was attending seances on the island of Jersey just before he wrote Les Mis. Is it a coincidence that both the original author of Cats and the original author of Les Mis were both attending seances and both connecting their work to Shakespeare while composing their works that, of all the incredible things that both men had written over their lifetime, are the specific works that would go on to become musicals? Is it possible, as Dirk Gently repeatedly insists that it is, all connected? Is this mere coincidence, or are there no coincidences? We will play with that idea, and I do mean play with it, in the next episode. Let me give Childs the final word as his take-home point, quote, "In the end, occultism, with which Eliot acknowledges that he has in the past aligned himself, and whose effect threw a rouge upon some of his contemporaries he is rather pragmatically still willing to condone in 1935, remains for Eliot an ambivalent modern phenomena. In his considered judgment, occultism is a preoccupation with the wrong supernatural world, but nonetheless, at least an interest in the supernatural world," end quote. There are some dangling issues concerning Eliot's flirtations with the occult. After dabbling and then rejecting them, he turned to traditional religion in a very hardcore way. After his disastrous marriage to Vivian, he ended up, by all accounts, very happily married to his second wife, Valerie, for his last stretch of years on the planet. These have been explored in prior episodes, so there's no need to rehash them here. But his life ends happier than it started, which isn't what you'd expect if he was indeed tormented by demons. Demons never grow old. Do you believe in ghosts? I think T.S. Eliot, the author of Cats, definitely did. He believed in a literal God, a literal heaven, a literal Satan, and a literal hell, as his very literal traditional religion taught. And according to Childs, he believed there might be something in between. Something you might be able to get into with the occult. Something you might call neither heaven nor hell, but maybe, I don't know, something like the Heaviside Layer. That will wrap this episode up, and the next episode will take us to the unexplored territory for this podcast, a classic demon possession story that is both totally made up but entirely historically possible. Join me at the crypt for the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.